I have a confession to make. When I first read the opening to Northern Lights, I was bored. I was 10 years old and bewildered by the amount of stuff the book was asking me to get my head around. The lore is dense with an alternative history of the world, unfamiliar political structures, strange technologies, and the concept of demons to grapple with in the first few chapters alone. It was all too much for me. When I tried again a few years later, I persevered, and His Dark Materials became formative to me. I discovered a deep and mysterious world that I longed to visit, and characters that I desperately wanted to meet and even aspired to be like. It was the first time I realised that reading was not merely fun but could be rewarding. The story actually improved with the effort that I put into understanding it. That was a bit of a revelation for me, and it's the reason I'm so attached to His Dark Materials as a series. So this is basically an admission of bias. There's rarely a harsher critic of an adaptation than someone who loves the source material. I'm going to try and be as balanced and objective as possible, but I feel like it's only fair to confess I am a fan. Anyway, to reiterate, we're going to take a critical look at the TV adaptation of His Dark Materials and see if we can't come up with some ways to improve on the areas where it's lacking. So obviously this episode's going to include spoilers for the first episode and the first few chapters of the book, but generally I'm going to try and keep this episode spoiler-free, at least in terms of what comes later in the story. If I ever get to a point where I can't avoid talking about specific spoilers, I'll section that bit off and keep it for the end of the episode, just in case anybody's watching along or reading along. But yeah, there's bits and pieces in here that some people might consider spoilery, so there's your warning. This hypothetical redraft, as we discussed in the intro video, is for an animated version rather than a live-action one. For this reason, one thing I'm not going to do is critique the casting or the performances. For what it's worth, I think the casting's fine, pretty good all round really, but I do feel like the performances are hampered by the writing and the direction. The show has a slightly patronising tone and tends to over-explain itself, with characters frequently telling each other things they clearly already know.
I thought we were protected by Scholastic Sanctuary.
Without Scholastic Sanctuary, you wouldn't be here.
I know the Magisterium have never ventured this far north, but really, I feel we're pushing our luck here.
Or actively describing what's going on in the scene.
Master's a good man. He's always been kind to us. He's poisoning my Uncle Pan.
Or in some cases, the same information's repeated.
Do you ever think about what animal Pan will settle as?
And your demons will assume their true form.
My son's demon has settled as a hawk.
Now, I can understand the creators wanted to make sure that nobody gets left behind, but I personally feel that rewarding viewers' engagement and concentration usually makes for a richer and more satisfying experience. Okay, maybe the show is aiming for a family audience and wants to be accessible to kids, but I'm not sure that constant hand-holding is the way to keep them engaged. The other thing worth mentioning is that I'm imagining our animated version would probably be made up of 25 to 30-minute episodes, rather than the hour-long runtime of the live-action version. Apart from anything else, that makes things more convenient for me, since there's a lot to talk about, and breaking the series down into half-hour-ish chunks feels more manageable. So there, you'll have to lump it. Alright, let's make a start. After an arguably unnecessary info dump which echoes the preface of the novel, the show opens with a prologue of sorts, in which Lord Asriel delivers the baby Lyra to Jordan College. Lyra, even at this stage in her life, has an awful lot of backstory which the novel can dole out at a much more leisurely pace than a TV version can, so this scene I think is a wise choice for efficiently establishing why Lyra lives in a university. I'd maybe rather have it told from the Master's perspective, so as to keep the audience a bit more distanced from Lord Asriel, but otherwise it worked. What doesn't work for me though, is what follows. We get two scenes that introduce the 12-year-old Lyra, as well as her friend Roger, and give a taste for what Lyra's life is like. They race around the college and then run down into the crypts to play with skeletons and talk about their demons for the benefit of the audience.
When he stops changing form?
I think about it.
The scenes are fine, in that they establish that Lyra is rebellious and inquisitive, she's friends with this Roger chap, and there's a slight tip of the hat to viewers familiar with the books, but that's about it. The setting of the crypt, while it is featured in the novel, doesn't actually add anything to the story either, so I think we can do a bit better. When we first meet Lyra in the book, she already inhabits two worlds. One, as we see in the show, is that of Jordan College, with its dusty academics, aloof scholars and army of serving staff. The other, which is left out of the show, is the world of the Oxford streets, with its Egyptian families on the canal and warring factions of street urchins. This duality in Lyra is an important aspect of her character. On the one hand, she's aware that she's nobly born, and of the status that living at Jordan College grants her, but all she did with that knowledge was to give herself airs and lord it over the other urchins. On the other hand, though, she's got rough edges. She's ill-mannered, petulant, she's a liar and a thief, and she's not afraid of a fight. In many ways, Lyra was a barbarian, the book tells us. She was a coarse, greedy little savage for the most part. Comparatively, the version we see in the show is squeaky clean, cheeky rather than insolent. So let's introduce Lyra in her element, waging war in back alleys. We can play a little bait and switch here by opening with her running full tilt down an alley, muddy, dishevelled and bloody-kneed, before hiding in a canal-side warehouse. We can ramp up the tension a little by revealing her pursuers, young men in silhouette accompanied by dogs. We can introduce Lyra's demon, Pantalaimon, by having a bird land on her shoulder and whispering something to her. When it looks like there's no escape, she springs her trap. She gives a whistle, or maybe even both her and Pan give the whistle at the same time, how cute would that be? And a gang of kids spring from their hiding places all around the warehouse and start pelting the pursuers with mud. In a flash, the whole place is filled with shrieking, laughing children, while various shape-shifting animals scrap and wrestle around them, until they get chased off by an angry dock worker at least. Then we can cut to a scene with Lyra leading the gang, which includes both Roger and Billy Costa, down a canal towpath. All the kids chatting excitedly. The line, "Next time you be the gobblers," should be included somewhere as a passing reference. Then we can introduce Mark Costa. The show seems to treat the fact that Lyra is familiar with Egyptians, and the Costa family in particular, as an afterthought. In the first episode, Lyra doesn't interact with any Egyptians. She does say that she knows them.
Billy Costa. I remember him, Tony's brother.
And there's a blink and you'll miss it reference to her stealing a boat once, but that's it. As a result, her connection with them, when it's revealed in later episodes, comes somewhat out of left field. So let's suggest their relationship here. Mark Costa can intercept the gang of children and give Billy a bollocking for getting so muddy before Tony's settling ceremony. She can also have a go at Lyra in an "I've got my eye on you" manner for being the ringleader. So then Lyra and Roger walk back to Jordan on their own. This is where we establish their relationship properly. In the show's crypt scene, their conversation about demons sort of comes out of nowhere and feels slightly forced.
Why do demons disappear when you die? And yet humans leave these nasty skeletons behind.
However, if they were to have a similar conversation on the walk back to Jordan, which was informed by Mark Costa's mention of Tony's ceremony, I think it would feel a bit more natural. This would also be a good place to include the story of the time Lyra and her gang stole the Costa's narrowboat, so that we can cement their relationship a bit. The book says Mark Costa has clouted Lyra dizzy on 2 occasions but given her hot gingerbread on 3. It might be nice to work that into the dialogue here too. Following the crypt scene, the show features a couple of scenes with Lord Asriel in the Arctic, taking pictures on a mountaintop and preparing to go to Oxford. I think we can lose these, since everything he's been doing is about to be explained anyway. And besides, the novel does a decent job, I think, of gradually broadening its scope in line with Lyra's experiences. Generally, we learn about the world as she does. Apart from one important exception, which I'll get back to later, we're rarely more than a couple of steps ahead of Lyra in terms of the information she has. I think this is a good structure which helps us to connect with her as a character, so let's adopt it as best we can. The show cuts back to Oxford with Lyra in a private lesson with the librarian, when Pan notices that Lord Asriel has arrived at the college. Lyra gives the librarian the slip and clambers over the rooftops so she can spy on Asriel's meeting. Now this is the kind of change I like to see in adaptations. The novel opens with Lyra sneaking into the retiring room, which is
expressly forbidden.
Just to have a bit of a nosy. The fact that Lord Asriel arrives while she's hiding in there is pure coincidence. Generally, I think if you're going to make changes to a story, getting rid of coincidence in the plot is a good place to start. So yeah, Asriel's arrival as motivation for Lyra sneaking into the retiring room is a definite improvement. However, I would make some significant changes to the scene, and I'll tell you for why. There's a character missing from the show who is, in my opinion, quite important. Her name is Mrs. Lonsdale. Now, granted, she does have much more of a role in later books, but I feel like her inclusion in Northern Lights is still valuable. Mrs. Lonsdale is a brash, no-nonsense woman who works for Jordan College and acts not quite as Lyra's mother, but as the person on whose shoulders the college seems to have placed the burden of Lyra. She has a habit of scrubbing Lyra's knees pink, a miniature representation of how she approaches her work. She's part of the mechanics of Lyra's upbringing. She is Jordan College's solution to the unusual problem of having a child living within the walls. I think it's important to show that not only has Lyra's little world shaped who she is, but also that she has, in some way, shaped it. Mrs. Lonsdale is evidence of that. Her role in the show is filled by Roger bringing Lyra breakfast and the librarian in a later scene, but there is a sense that something's missing. If this little girl has lived in the college all her life, then who was looking after her when she was a toddler? Who brought her clothes when she outgrew them? Who changed her bed? So here's what we'll do instead. When Lyra and Roger get back to Jordan, Mrs. Lonsdale's on the lookout for her. She's heard that Lord Asriel is on his way, and she wants to get Lyra scrubbed up before he arrives. Lyra's reluctant. In our version, she isn't quite so enamoured with Asriel. We'll hew closer to the novel in this respect, but more on that later. So after a brief scene in which Lyra is bullied and cajoled into relative cleanliness, it'll be Mrs. Lonsdale, rather than the librarian, who Lyra gives the slip to. Perhaps we can overhear the servants in disarray, as Asriel has decided to give a presentation in the retiring room, which the book describes as unorthodox. Or maybe word has come through that Lord Asriel doesn't have time to see Lyra on this visit. And so Lyra sneaks off and we rejoin the BBC version in the retiring room. The retiring room sequence is all pretty good. In our version though, it'll serve as our first proper introduction to Lord Asriel, since we've lost the scenes with him in the Arctic and shifted the focus of the prologue. It should also be where we're introduced to the librarian, Charles. In the book, Lyra's task while she's hidden in the cupboard is to keep an eye on the master, and Asriel engineers things so that the master and the librarian are sat only a matter of a yard or so from where she is. She overhears them whispering to each other, which would be a good opportunity to establish their anxieties about the magisterium and Asriel's heresy. There are a couple of other small things that the show leaves out, which I think would be worth including. The first is when one of the scholars asks if the child in the photograph is a severed child. A very sinister phrase in and of itself, and one which, without wanting to get spoilery, would make for some good foreshadowing. This scene is also where Lyra first hears of the Panzerbjorn, or the Armoured Bears, and she overhears a detail concerning the king of the bears, Iofur Raknison, which is important later in the story. Following the retiring room sequence is the Egyptian settling ceremony, but we'll come back to that. First, I want to justify changes I've made to a couple of later scenes with Lord Asriel. The first is when he takes Lyra to bed after his presentation. This scene presents a softer side to Asriel, and it shows that their relationship in the show is closer than that in the book. Personally, though, I think it's better to keep Asriel as a bit of an enigma. The book describes him as a tall man with powerful shoulders, a fierce dark face, and eyes that seem to flash and glitter with savage laughter. It was a face to be dominated by, or to fight, never a face to patronise or pity. He's an intimidating figure, and the reader is left guessing whether he can be trusted. Suffice to say that there are later points in the story that I think will be more engaging if we maintain a bit of that mystery. This bedroom scene also shows us that Lyra has been dreaming of travelling to the north with her uncle for a long time, whereas in the book the thought only occurs to her after the episode in the retiring room. The fact that her adventure takes her to the very place that she'd been dreaming of going smacks of coincidence, so I'd lose this too. Apart from anything else, it's convenient from a screenwriting perspective to have the audience learn about the North as Lyra does, rather than have characters sharing information they already know for the benefit of the viewers. Then we come to the airship scene, in which Asriel is leaving and Lyra begs to go with him before running off in tears. So not Lyra's style. I don't think the scene adds anything, since we already know that Asriel's going back to the North from the dialogue in the retiring room, and we know that he's not going to take Lyra with him. The only valuable piece of information this scene gives us is that Lyra's parents died on an airship.
Did it look like this?
What?
The airship that my parents died in!
The line is completely unmotivated and feels very forced. However, the information is necessary to include somewhere, and it's a difficult subject to bring up naturally. I'll circle back around to it in a minute. So instead of the bedroom scene and the airship scene, in our version the last time we see Asriel will be back in the retiring room, when he wakes up Lyra after the presentation. She can ask all of the questions she does in the bedroom scene, but here Asriel can maintain his harsh edge. This is from the book. Do as you're told and go to bed. Don't argue anymore, or I shall be angry. And his demon growled with a deep, savage rumble that made Lyra suddenly aware of what it would be like to have teeth meeting her throat. Lyra compressed her lips and frowned hard at her uncle. He was pumping the air from the vacuum flask and took no notice. It was as if he'd already forgotten her. Next we're going to rejig the scenes a little. We're still not going to the Egyptian ceremony just yet, but we're going to join the master and the librarian in the study. This can play out much as it does in the show. All the information is valuable, and it's good to give the master an opportunity to justify himself for trying to poison Asriel. The fact that this essentially good, kind man who's honoured Lyra's claim of scholastic sanctuary felt it necessary to kill off Asriel shows us just how worried about Lyra he is, and how far he'd go to protect her. This is the point at which the viewers/readers learn something very significant that Lyra doesn't, that she is spoken of in Witch prophecy, that she could decide the fate of many worlds, and that her journey will also include a great betrayal.
The irony is she has to do it all without realizing what she's doing.
All important details for contextualizing Lyra's adventure. I think this would also be a good time to include the information about Lyra's parents dying in an airship crash. Just feels like the most appropriate place to bring it up. Then, finally, we get to the Egyptian ceremony. I like the concept of this scene, which is entirely new for the show. It feels suitably Egyptian-y, it demonstrates the kind of community they are, and it's a neat way of discussing demon settling that feels baked into the world rather than just a convenient talking point. Tony Costa is much younger here than he is in the book, but I think that's a change that works well, especially later on when he begins to rebel against Egyptian leadership. One thing that does annoy me though, and I promise not to do this all the time, but Ma Costa's demon is absent from her son's demon settling ceremony, which is just... come on. The sequence ends with Billy Costa wandering off and getting snatched away by the gobblers. Eagle-eared viewers. Do eagles hear good? Is that a thing? I know owls do. Owl-eared? No. Watchers of the show who listen good and who are also familiar with the book might pick up on the name of Billy's demon, Rata. In the book, the demon Rata belongs to another boy, Tony Makarios, who we also see getting lured into a gobbler trap. Combining the two characters into one is a smart move on the part of the writers, as it adds weight to a later revelation. And that, I think, is where our first episode will end, on the distinctly down note of a child being kidnapped. Tune in next week and all that. So for a quick recap then, this is what our first episode looks like. We've got the prologue in which Lyra's place at Jordan is established, but with the emphasis shifted to the Master. Then we introduce Lyra, Roger, Billy Costa and Mark Costa in one fell swoop while the kids are playing around the canals, and we learn that there's going to be a settling ceremony later on. Then we stick with Lyra as she returns to Jordan, where we introduce Mrs. Lonsdale, Lyra's not particularly motherly caregiver. She scrubs Lyra up, but Lyra gives her the slip and sneaks off to the retiring room. The scenes in the retiring room play out largely unchanged. The Master tries to poison Asriel, Lyra foils the plan, we learn a bit about dust, or at least that it's a heretical idea. We see the city in the sky, and we find out that everything Asriel is doing is bound to make the mysterious but powerful Magisterium angry. We expand the sequence to include what we've lost in the bedroom scene, and find that Lyra has now decided on a whim that she wants to go exploring too. Then we have the Master and the Librarian discussing the sinister forces and dark secrets bubbling under the surface, and we learn that Lyra's parents died in an airship crash. Then finally we go along to the Egyptian settling ceremony, where we get a taste for the Egyptian way of life and we're introduced to Tony Costa, just before his little brother Billy, a character we've actually met in this version, gets snatched away to God knows where. So that's the end of episode 1. Obviously this is all my opinion, so feel free to disagree and discuss it all in the comments. Thanks for watching and all that, and yeah, see you next time.